is my great honor to be your moderator for this panel. My name is Karen Hamilton, and in my day job, I'm the General Secretary of the Canadian Council of Churches, and have the privilege of knowing some of these folk who are your panel for this afternoon, and having met and now consider good friends the others whom I had not met before. You know that the title of this session is Truth and Reconciliation, Understanding the Present and Looking to the Future in the Light of the Past. We will be continuing, as we have been doing for the last day, to examine some very deep and challenging questions over the course of the next just under an hour that the four panelists are going to speak to us, and then in the course of the questions that will be all of our opportunity to engage in these issues, we're going to be reflecting on the fact that it's now 5 years after the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and we know that for many in Canada, even the very term Truth and Reconciliation Commission is not exactly a household word. We're going to be delving into the meaning of it, or not, as a reality in Canada. We're going to be looking at, and the panelists will be engaging us all in these kind of questions, we're going to be looking at how we keep relationships moving forward. What is truth? What is reconciliation? How will we know it when we see it? How will we know it when we experience it? How do we absorb the lessons of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and move forward? In terms of process, each of our panelists is going to have just under 15 minutes to speak to us, and I have colleagues in the front row, thanks to your suggestions, panelists, who are going to keep us on the straight and narrow in terms of the time. They have a piece of paper, and of course, it's written in red. That'll give you a 5-minute warning and a 1-minute warning. So each of our panelists will have just under 15 minutes to speak to us. We will take a short break. Did you hear the underlining on that word? A short break while we get microphones on up here on everyone, and then come back. I'll give a short opportunity for the panelists to engage each other. There may be particular points from each other's conversations that they want to take forward, and then it will be, as you know so well, your opportunity to ask questions. Truth and reconciliation. Understanding the present, looking to the future in the light of the past. I'm going to introduce our speakers one at a time in the order in which they are going to speak, which means, Kathleen, I'm going to begin with you. Kathleen Mahoney is a law professor at the University of Calgary. She was chief negotiator for the Assembly of First Nations for the historic Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement and was a major architect of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There is much more about Kathleen, which is written in your program book. I invite you to read it, not while she's speaking, of course, but I invite you to read it. But I wanted to thank you, Kathleen, for a particular piece of conversation already. Over lunch, we had the privilege of talking about Kathleen's role as counsel for Bosnia-Herzegovina in their genocide action against Serbia at the International Court of Justice, and having just come back myself from Croatia, that conversation had particular resonance. But Kathleen, please come and speak to us, Truth and Reconciliation.
Well, thank you very much for that nice introduction. And first of all, I'd like to add my voice to the congratulations for the organizers of this conference, which I think is very important. And I especially want to thank them for inviting me to speak to you today. I'm very honored to do so. And the topic of truth and reconciliation, in my view, is crucial to the relationship between the First Peoples in Canada, yet it is too often misunderstood. Conferences such as this one, I hope, and I'm sure the rest of my panelists hope, will add to better understanding and awareness of reconciliation and its very important role in the betterment of the country and in the creation of a true, mature, and authentic Canadian identity. I can tell you that as the chief negotiator for the Assembly of First Nations in the settlement process, which started in 2003, reconciliation and creating conditions for its achievement were at the heart of our negotiations for the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. We believed that the settlement agreement could be one of the most, if not the most, significant turning point in the relationship between Aboriginal peoples in Canada if all of the parties joined together in striving towards a common goal of reconciliation. On the other hand, we also believed that if reconciliation was deliberately or even negligently thwarted by any of the parties, the relationship could be set back for generations to come. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that throughout the Indian residential school settlement process, including the apology of the Prime Minister and the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we today have been living one of the most important chapters in our nation's history. Opportunities to change the course of history do not come around very often, as our politicians have told us earlier today. And if the opportunity the settlement agreement provides to do this is missed because of misunderstandings about what reconciliation means, the loss will be immeasurable to this country. So I would like to start then with a story I borrowed from a commissioner of the South African Truth Commission, Reverend Bongani Finka, which identifies a common misunderstanding about reconciliation. He told this story when he attended a conference on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission I organized at the University of Calgary back in 2007. The story is the cow story. It seems there was a gentleman called Thabo who had a cow. One day, Mr. Smith, who was his superior power, overcame Thabo and took his cow away from him. Thabo suffered from the loss of the cow. He lost his livelihood, he became poor, he became depressed, and he couldn't provide proper housing for his children or get them the things they needed to have a successful life. Many years later, along came a Truth Commission, and Thabo and Mr. Smith were reunited in a process of reconciliation. Mr. Smith offered an apology. Thabo accepted the apology. They hugged, they kissed. They even had a cup of tea together and shared a few jokes. At the end of the day, Mr. Smith left the room, and as he was going out the gate, Thabo asked, "Mr. Smith, what about the cow?" Mr. Smith said, "Thabo, you're messing this thing up about reconciliation. It's got nothing to do with the cow." I repeat this story because talking about the cow is what reconciliation is all about. In the Canadian context, talking about the cow would be talking truthfully, openly, and comprehensively about how Canada has treated its First Peoples for centuries, the harms it has caused, and how we can move away from our past history of genocidal oppression in ways that will embrace equality and human rights. As I reread our research, position papers, briefing notes, press releases, and personal stories produced from our work on the settlement agreement in preparation for today, it is clear to me that over the past 10 years, much has become known that was unknown before. New information is still coming to light that was hidden for decades. In addition to requiring over 150,000 Aboriginal children to attend residential schools where almost a third of them were sexually, physically, and psychologically abused, we now know that the Canadian authorities knowingly and willfully starved Aboriginal children in residential schools to conduct nutritional experiments, that the Canadian government was complicit in mass tuberculosis deaths of Aboriginal children in residential schools and with adults on reserves. We know that forced sterilization of Aboriginal girls and women took place under government-enforced eugenic policies, especially in my province of Alberta. We know that governments actively participated in mass apprehensions of Aboriginal children permanently moving thousands of them to non-Aboriginal families. These are just a few of the numerous atrocities, all designed to solve the Indian problem through destroying Aboriginal identity. But all of those examples I have given you, none of that information was voluntarily provided. I'm sure there will be even more horrific revelations as time goes on. I personally know a number of anecdotal stories from my clients, which I have not revealed because I haven't done this study that the professor did in doing the nutritional work, but I'm sure they're true. Even as these more horrific revelations become known, I think it's a good thing, because as long as dark secrets remain, lies can continue to be told, and Canadians can be fooled into thinking everything's just fine when it's not fine. Once history is known, it can't be unknown. As was stated so eloquently by Michael Ignatieff in his speech at the AFN University of Calgary conference in 2007, a truth commission at the very least limits the range of permissible lies. So to participate in reconciliation, Canada must voluntarily disclose all its past human rights violations and genocidal policies. It must reveal all the documents and evidence in its possession so that the breadth and depth of the wrongs committed can be known and understood and responsibility taken for them. If, on the other hand, the truth has to be forced out of Canada bit by bit through court orders and other adversarial processes, reconciliation will not happen, and the despair will deepen as each new atrocity is exposed. Talking about the cow also includes being truthful about power, understanding who has power over the past so as to determine who has power over the present. It includes talking about what government policies should be to best combat present-day racism and about how to advance the position of Aboriginal peoples in Canadian society today. It can be about improving Aboriginal education, as we heard this morning, protecting, preserving, and strengthening Aboriginal languages, culture, and tradition, sharing economic opportunities, and appointing Aboriginal Canadians to high positions of power. Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians have not lived the same history, and being truthful about our differences could go some distance towards achieving reconciliation. Talking about the cow also requires talking about justice and fairness, and a meeting of the minds that justice can and must be done for past wrongs. Rupert Ross relates a story told to him by a Mohawk woman who said that in her community, they had an expression for the meeting of the minds, that moment of justice as they understand it, only it was called face cracking. It is the moment when the hard exterior of injustice cracks and a connection between wrongdoers and victims takes place on an emotional level. This place is a spiritual realm where healing and reconciliation start to occur. But as the Mohawk woman explained, face cracking cannot take place unless there's an understanding of the victim's experience of being wronged. If we only look at wrongs in the abstract, objective, legal way, as Professor Poitras discussed this morning, no connection will likely occur. To illustrate, take a matter of a simple purse snatching on the street. In terms of the law, all that has happened is the loss of a purse. It can be fixed by a conviction, a return of the purse, or maybe a fine. That's it. But if we looked at the purse snatching from the victim's experience, we would understand that the harm of the purse snatching is much more than the value of the purse. It harms the relationship the victim has with her community. Unless this is recognized, that her relationship with the community has been altered by the purse snatching, and unless that is talked about and dealt with, she will not feel safe in that community. It is likely she will feel that way indefinitely. In other words, she will not heal. She will never have that face-cracking moment. What the residential schools and other genocidal policies did was to put two cultures into fundamental conflict. The effects of that conflict altered the relationship between them in a very deep, profound, and negative way. For reconciliation to occur, this relational damage must be understood from the victim's perspective, and the steps taken to repair that relationship led by that perspective. The Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, including the TRC, or the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, is based on a political agreement the AFN reached with Canada in 2005. The AFN was able to convince the government that the path they were on with respect to residential school claims through the courts and the alternate dispute resolution process was doomed to failure as far as reconciliation was concerned. The principles the AFN insisted upon to guide the compensation process was to be inclusive, fair, accessible, and transparent, to offer a holistic and comprehensive response recognizing and addressing all the harms committed in and resulting from residential schools, respect human dignity and equality and racial and gender equality, contribute towards reconciliation and healing, and do no harm to survivors and their families. Under the leadership of National Chief Phil Fontaine and guided by these principles, our team negotiated a holistic political agreement with the intention of creating conditions for reconciliation or face cracking. The agreement we reached had a number of elements. It provided for fairer and more just compensation for victims of abuse, a common experience payment for each resident of a residential school, healing funds for communities, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a fund for commemoration, a fund for legal fees, an early payment for the elderly, an apology from the Prime Minister, and a provision to keep the AFN playing a key and central role in its implementation. The subsequent agreement, with all the parties around the table, incorporated all of these elements and is unique in the world in its comprehensive coverage and level of compensation provided. However, the agreement can only go so far. When it comes to a meeting of the minds or face cracking, as described by the Mohawk woman, the victim's reality must inform those working on the other side of the table, whether it's the individual assessment process, the common experience payment, or the TRC. In other words, Canada and the churches and their legal representatives must strive to implement the agreement as much as possible from the victim's subjective perspective, taking their feelings, understandings, experiences, and knowledge into account and respecting them. But I and many other lawyers working within the process for survivors have unfortunately noticed that Canada, and to some extent the churches, are moving now in the opposite direction from the agreement's original intent. There is a well-founded perception that in the past 2 years or so, Canada and some churches have adopted a more adversarial, cost-saving strategy to avoid paying compensation to survivors by delaying the process unnecessarily, by imposing narrow and highly technical interpretations of the agreement, by refusing to provide necessary documents, and by imposing arbitrary new rules on the process. Specifically, the processes associated with the individual assessment process, the common experience payment, and the TRC have become more legalistic and adversarial than they have ever been before, without any apparent attempt to negotiate or mediate these disputes. When a dispute arises, the common response is, "We will see you in court." This attitude in turn diminishes the sense in the survivor community and in the Aboriginal community generally that justice or healing or face cracking will ever be achieved. The inevitable consequence will be a sense of betrayal and re-victimization, not justice or reconciliation. I can give you a couple of examples. A recent example is a case where Canada argued that a claimant does not qualify under the settlement agreement for compensation because the sexual abuse he endured occurred in a classroom in a part of the residential school building that was designated for teaching day school students. Even though this particular claimant was a resident, and even though he endured sexual abuse, Canada says he does not qualify for compensation because the room he was abused in was not a room in the residence. Thank you. There are numerous other examples I could provide, but I'm telling you, I'm being told that my time is up. I think Marie will probably talk about the dispute that the TRC has had with Canada with respect to documents, which I think very much addresses the point I've been making to you about telling the truth. But in conclusion then, what I would like to say is that from my experience in negotiating the agreement and working with all the parties to the agreement and with individual claimants as well, I believe the challenge of achieving reconciliation will remain with us for years to come. I think a lesson that we're all learning is that actions such as revealing the past, paying reparations, apologizing, and creating a world-class settlement agreement cannot on their own accomplish reconciliation. It's far too big a project. No settlement agreement on its own can deal with the harms caused by generations of colonial domination and genocidal practices. It just doesn't work that way. However, I do believe the settlement agreement, if it is implemented in the spirit with which it was created, has the potential to enhance Canada's reputation and to increase the stature and respect for First Peoples everywhere. The longer run success of the agreement will depend very much on attitudes both of the claimants, their families, their communities, and the parties who perpetrated the atrocities upon them. So on that note, I'd just like to say thank you very much for your attention, and my experience and opportunity to have done this work has been the most rewarding and satisfying work of my entire career, and I just want to take this opportunity to publicly acknowledge that fact and all of the people that worked so terribly hard on this settlement agreement, and I hope for all of our sakes that that work will not be for naught. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen, for your words and for the images that you have given us, the stories and the image of the face cracking. David MacDonald is a former Member of Parliament, Cabinet Minister, and Canadian Ambassador. He served as a Member of Parliament from 1965 to 1980 and from 1988 to 1993. You can read more in his bio about his time as Secretary of State, Minister of Communications, and Canada's Ambassador to Ethiopia and Sudan. David is also a minister of the United Church of Canada since 1961, and since 1998 has been a special advisor to the United Church on Indigenous justice and residential schools, doing a lot of that work I just happened to know on a cell phone in a corridor. For the past decade, David has been deeply immersed in the creation and work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Just take a moment to get set up here, put all my junk in the right order. Like all the other speakers, I am honored to be here, challenged to be here, happy to be here. And again, as in many instances of fundamental social, what shall I call it, not disagreement, of social breakdown, there are many stories to tell. And so I'm happy to be here to very briefly share a bit of my story, because it is a story in many ways. And when Kathleen was speaking, and as you can imagine, Kathleen and I have spent many hours together discussing all this, negotiating some of it, exploring with others what it is we could possibly accomplish. And I have to say this at the outset. You know, when we were having those long meetings back in 2004, 2005, I thought to myself, having a Truth and Reconciliation Commission on this issue is next to impossible. But if we can get all the parties, and remember, apart from being surrounded by lawyers, we had 4 major churches represented, we had the 2 national Aboriginal organizations, we had the Assembly of First Nations, which Kathleen has just described, and we had the representative of many of the survivors. And Frankie Akabuchi had to kind of be the ringmaster for those conversations. And the fact that we could agree on all the things that Kathleen mentioned, including a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, seemed nothing short of miraculous to me. But I have to say to both Kathleen and Phil, who I love dearly and have shared so much with, that was the easy part. The tough part is to actually have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission and have it accomplish many of the goals that Kathleen has described. I'm still too busy to ever try and write it all down, but it was exactly the same year, 2003, that the AFN started its serious work towards having that comprehensive agreement, that George Erasmus came to our United Church General Council in the summer of 2003 to report on the Aboriginal Healing Foundation and its important work, and to talk about what had or hadn't happened as a result of the Royal Commission, which he'd chaired on Aboriginal peoples. And then looking at our delegates sitting out there at Acadia University, he said, now there's one thing we did not accomplish when we had our Royal Commission. There's one thing that staggered us because it was something that came up day after day, year after year. And that was the impact of Indian residential schools. In one of our chapters, chapter 11, I think it was, we called for a separate public inquiry on residential schools. And it didn't happen. The government didn't want it. Many of the churches didn't want it. Nobody seemed to be that interested. But you people, you United Church people, you were there, you were involved. Why don't you do something about this? And that lit a spark for us that eventually linked up with the work that Kathleen talked about to give some of the momentum behind having this Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But we did not really know what we were getting into. We did not really understand. I mean, Kathleen says the history that's being revealed, none of us had any idea of much of what was going to come out. And we still don't. And we're 4 years into it. We're just a little less than a year to go. So we have an enormous challenge in front of us. Have had, will have, and will certainly have when the Commission winds up its work mid-next year and makes its final reports. But I want to start, that was just my introduction. I still have time of it? Does that count? That still goes against the 15 minutes? Okay. Well, there you go. You can't win in this business, you know. You just have to do what you can do. Okay. Paul Martin did something very interesting yesterday in his opening. I don't know whether you intended it, but you sort of revealed what a steep learning curve some of us who've been in public life had to take on when we discovered something like residential schools was a reality in this country and what they were all about. Now, he could at least say, well, at least by the time I became a member of Parliament in 1988, most of those schools didn't exist. Well, there was one or two that existed up until the mid-90s, but most of them are gone. I became a member of Parliament, as Karen said, in 1965. Yeah, I'm still here. I always have to check. And I was a member of Parliament when we had conversations about Aboriginal peoples and what was going on, Indian peoples, Eskimos. You know, the terms all changed now, but... And I was even there, sitting in the House of Commons, when Jean Chrétien introduced his white paper with Trudeau's blessing. And I have to say, in this, it's sort of like a public confessional. We don't do confession much in the United Church, but Jim, you're more familiar with this in the Roman Catholic Church. I have to say, as a moment of deep confession, it took me a lot longer than that first period of being in Parliament. In fact, it came long after I was actually out of Parliament in the late 90s, when I got a phone call from the United Church headquarters saying, we've got a problem on our hands. We're being sued by a whole bunch of people who were in our residential schools for what happened to them there, and particularly the school in Port Alberni, British Columbia. I was first of all shocked, and secondly, I was totally surprised because what did I know about any of this? And I think in some ways, even though we've had the commission for 4 years, and Marie can speak more eloquently to this than any of the rest of us, we are still at a very early period of unpacking what has actually been part of our history. Now, we've heard a lot last night from Roberta and this morning from Phil and Paul and others, but this is all still very new, very raw stuff, and we're not quite sure what to do with it. We're hearing about white privilege. We're hearing about white guilt. But how do we deal with that in a way that doesn't immobilize us, but gives us the courage to react in some fashion, in some kind of positive way? And I have to tell you that as one person who has been involved in the residential school issue for now 15 years, that is still a question I struggle with on a daily basis. Somebody asked me a few minutes ago, what is it that keeps you going after 15 years of working in this? And I have to say that I think the thing that keeps me going most are the incredible people who are survivors, the ones who've actually agreed to see me as a friend. Now, this hasn't always been the case. Those of you who were deeply involved in the 90s will remember when the AFN sponsored the exploratory dialogues, Phil, that brought together church people and survivors and sponsored by the AFN to talk to one another about this whole experience of residential schools. I was just getting started, but I heard from my colleagues who were there, they had never experienced the kind of pain and anger that was in the room from Aboriginal peoples. And remember, if you think about the history a bit, in the 60s and 70s, the churches were big supporters of solidarity, big supporters of, Project North and the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline. And so at the end of the 70s and even into the early 80s, there was a sense that we're on the same page with Aboriginal peoples. We understand them. We know where they're coming from. We can be supportive. We can help them get out of some of the problems that we've heard again and again here last night and again today. So when the churches ended up being sued by people that they thought they were friends with and being sued for things that they couldn't believe they were responsible for, it was like some kind of a psychic meltdown. And I have to think some of that is still around. And you will be tempted to think, I think, because it can be documented, that all of the struggles that Kathleen has mentioned here today have not gone away. Some of them are still carrying on. That the churches must be just, sitting on the sidelines, weeping and wailing, saying, what are they going to do? Well, maybe there are a number of people who are related to or a part of or what have you, some religious community. But there are also some very courageous people who have been giving leadership. I know we've got some of them here this afternoon. Ed Bianchi, who's back there with Kairos, and has worked with Kairos for how many years, Ed?
Since it started.
Is that before or after the flood?
Slightly
What year? What's that?
12 years.
12 years. 12 years, yeah. Well, before that, it was the Aboriginal Rights Coalition, so that's even longer. And I know that Maggie McLeod, who heads up our Aboriginal Ministries, is here somewhere. Maggie, are you here? Yep, and sitting at the back. And others who are here because they believe that while the churches are responsible and we have made various apologies, we now have to live out those apologies. And that's where the rubber hits the road, living out those apologies. I felt a little bit last night and this morning, that was a bit of a gap in our conversation so far. Many of us in this room know what the right thing to do is as far as either the federal government's concerned or institutions like the churches should do, but how do we make that happen? That was really some of the substance of the conversation with Kathleen Wynne this afternoon. And we have to ask ourselves, how do we make it happen for all of us? Not just the leadership, but the people in the pews, in the communities, in the places where people need to be present. I think it was Sheila McLean this morning who said something, or no, I think it was Marilyn. I can't remember now. I've heard so many different comments, but something about you can't have a relationship unless you're both in the room at the same time. I would go a little farther. You can't have reconciliation unless you have a relationship. And I believe that is, in fact, I don't want to say it's the most important thing, but it's so far up the list in terms of really making a difference that I don't want to underestimate it. You know, when we started and put together the commission, we really had two objectives, and correct me if I'm wrong, Kathleen. One was we needed to honor, respect, and hear from each and every survivor or members of their family or the community who had been impacted by Indian residential schools. And Marie, again, can tell us more about how that has been going over the last 4 years. And that is certainly was and is and still is a central objective of the TRC. To give some visibility to these people, 80,000 of whom are still alive today, to have their story respected, to release them from the stranglehold of what they have experienced as little children in one of the 135 schools that operated. But there's a second objective. And the second objective is that we wanted to engage with all the population of Canada, not just the 3 or 4% of the population who have in some way been directly impacted by residential schools, but all of us who have all been impacted by residential schools. Phil, when he was national chief back in 2004, he may not even remember this, phoned me up one night. I was sitting in my office. I don't know why I thought I'd be in the office at 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night, but he phoned me and he said, I got an idea. I said, oh yeah, what's that? He said, I think we need to have a conference, and this was in 2004, remember, on the theme, is reconciliation possible? I said, ooh, wow, that's an interesting question. Yeah, he said, and I've been thinking of some of the people who might speak there. And Kathleen really helped organize and put that conference together. He said, I've got a topic for you to speak on. I said, okay. What's the topic? He said, I want you to speak about the harm done to Canada with residential schools. There are not many topics I've wrestled with harder, Phil, than that one before that event in March of 2004. Because I had never really thought about it I thought about it in terms, you know, as I got to know things about the individuals, the communities, the families who were multi-generationally affected, but the rest of us, the harm that was done to us, that's the part of the conversation that we very much still need to have. Because if we're going to release ourselves from a century of tragic history, of destructive history, we can't do it sitting on the sidelines. We have to be engaged. We have to have those painful conversations and have those conversations not just in a passing moment or at a weekend conference, but in a way that allows us to move out of our present dilemma. A few days after I was appointed 15 years ago to help the United Church deal with residential schools, I went to my first AFN meeting. I've gone to 30 national meetings now of the AFN. That must qualify me for some kind of a pension, I think, Phil. And at the very first meeting, I'm not going to name the person because that would not be fair, but I met the senior person in the AFN dealing with residential schools. And I was introduced to her by a mutual friend as the new person who was working for the United Church on residential schools. Her immediate response was, so you're the new guy we're going to boil in oil. You know, we've become such good friends since that person and I, but it reflected, I think, a sense of such distance, such unhappiness, and such tragedy that it would take a lot of time and a lot of work to really mend that rip in the social fabric. I've got 45 seconds left. As you can see, this is a subject which is very close to my heart and very important, I think, to the future of this country. It's important for the reason that I haven't mentioned yet, but a one that keeps coming up over the last day and a half. And that is, we're not just talking about the damage of residential schools to individuals. We're talking about the damage to Canada in the way we treat Mother Earth. That is also part of the challenge that we have to face. I'm just about over. I want to recommend 2 books that if you can get them, you should read them. One is this tremendous book by Pauline Reagan, who works for the TRC, Unsettling the Settler Within, Indian Residential Schools, Truth-Telling and Reconciliation in Canada. If you want to know a lot more and know it in a very clear way, Paulette's book is one you should read. Aboriginal Healing Foundation put out this book club edition, Speaking My Truth, which I think you can still get for free by simply dropping them a line or getting in touch with the Aboriginal Healing Foundation or the Legacy of Truth, Legacy of Hope Foundation, and they will help you in support of changing the conversation, creating the relationship, and moving towards reconciliation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, for weaving your story into the story of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. James Weisgerber is the Archbishop of Winnipeg, who spent a certain amount of his life going back and forth between Saskatchewan and Manitoba. He was born in Saskatchewan, and between Saskatchewan and Ottawa, actually, he's been there as well, obtained degrees in philosophy and theology. He was ordained a Roman Catholic priest in 1963. He has taught philosophy, religious studies, and French, and the same thing I say to you, my sisters and brothers. You can read more in the bio in the book. But when he was pastor of Holy Trinity Parish in Regina, as well as Our Lady of Sorrows Parish in Fort Capel, there was pastoral ministry to First Nations reserves in the neighboring community and area. In 1990, he was elected General Secretary of the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops. He's been the Bishop of Saskatoon, and in 2000, he came to be Archbishop of Winnipeg. James.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. I spent most of my adult life in Regina, Saskatoon, and Winnipeg. So navigating the future together is really important, because I know deep, deep, deep in my heart that unless we move together in justice and in mutual respect, there's no moving ahead for anyone. There cannot be winners and losers. We either all win or we all lose. So this is going to be a little different presentation. I've been asked to tell my story. It's going to be a little more folksy. I suspect Phil has got something to do with this. But it's good for the younger people here to know how the older generation has had to struggle with these issues. I'm a 4th-generation settler in the prairies in Saskatchewan, in southern Saskatchewan. And the Catholic Church in that time had a very neat division of labor. The Oblates of Mary Immaculate, who are an independent order, arrived first in the West, and they were preoccupied with the First Nations people. That's what they did. The reserves, the people when they were not in reserves yet, and then finally the schools. They looked after that. They had the monopoly on all of that. And when the other church, the settler church, got organized, it looked after the settlers. And the two simply didn't meet. They were two kind of isolations. So I grew up really close to some reserves, very near one of the residential schools. We knew nothing about it. Just these wonderful stories, the wonderful thing about the heroic work that was being done in these schools. And that was part of the story that I grew up with. Now, in the 60s, and I can't spend a lot of time talking about this, there's kind of a perfect storm. It's sort of the beginning of the end of the colonial mentality of the colonizers, not the colonizer, but those who have been colonized, began to understand and become angry with that. And at the same time, the Oblates ran out of steam. And they were withdrawing their people because they were getting older. There were no new recruits. And suddenly, we were in charge, the settler church. And the bishop didn't know what to do. There was nobody with any experience. Nobody was able to go to the reserves. So I volunteered. So I went to Fort Capel. I was there in the Capel Valley working on 4 Indian reserves for about 4 years. And you know, that was in the early 80s. And I never once heard anything about the residential schools. Now, what I've come to realize since, that the people who came to church were either not aware of the way they had been impacted, or they were much too polite to talk about it at that time. So I simply never learned anything about that. And then in 1990, I was elected, a job I didn't apply for, but I was elected the General Secretary of the Conference of Bishops, which is the senior bureaucrat in the church. Now, the Conference of Bishops operates like the AFN. It's an association of chiefs, and it has no authority in any individual band, any individual diocese. But I got there in July, and I really hadn't even warmed the chair when Phil dropped the bombshell about having been abused in the residential school. And that was kind of a watermark, a watershed mark. There were some rumors about, which we didn't take too seriously, but once Phil, the AFN, has spoken, there was no turning back. So I organized a meeting in the next, I think it was January 1991 in Saskatoon. We got together all the bishops in whose diocese there were residential school, all the religious orders who had participated in that, and it was really wild. We were abhorred, we were upset, we were indignant, we were in denial. How could they do this to us? But there were some survivors there, and they began to talk to us. They weren't listened to very, very well, but some people did. And to their credit, the Oblate leadership was there in the next year at the Lac St. Anne pilgrimage. They gave a fairly fulsome apology. I think it was one of the first that came from the churches. So the pressure kept on. We kept going to meetings, got involved, as David said, ecumenically, meeting with the government, meeting with Aboriginal groups. Slowly and slowly, we learned the lesson. And I have to say that I went from believing that these were really good institutions in which bad things had happened to getting a pretty clear idea that these were horrible ideas in which probably some good things may have happened. And that was a sea change for me. So that when in 2007 Prime Minister Harper issued the apology in all of our names, I was certainly prepared to back that up, and I was very happy about that. But that's not the end of the story, because Phil was still on the scene. And by the year 2008, sometimes I forget my numbers, I was the president of the Conference of Bishops, and so I get to choose who we get to speak at the plenary meeting. And I heard by the grapevine that Phil really wanted to talk to the bishops. So because I was the president, I could invite him, and I did. And there was a lot of tension. I know Phil was very apprehensive because he knew that the bishops knew who started all this. And the bishops knew that too. Well, Phil is a master politician. He came, he put his speech aside and simply spoke to them, and in the end he got a standing ovation. I mean, it was absolutely wonderful, and kudos to Phil. And later on, in conversation with him, I understood that they really would like to have a meeting with the Pope. So that fall, I was in Rome for an annual meeting. I was sitting with the Pope and talking, and I had forgotten about this. But suddenly, in the middle of the meeting, I remembered. And I said, you know, the way we're structured, you are the only person who can speak for the Catholic Church, the whole Catholic Church. And this has gone on in Canada, and we really need somebody at your level, there's not too many at that level, to, to acknowledge this and to say we're sorry. And the Pope said, well, that's my job. I'm very happy about that. Now, develop a project and give it to the Secretary of State. Well, sometime I'm going to write a book about the next 7 or 8 months. They were very, very interesting. But in 2009, I believe it was, Phil and 4 other members of the delegation, plus 4 former missionaries, myself, we went to Rome. We were greeted by the Holy Father. And he gave a very fulsome, I don't think he used the word apology because I'm not sure that that's an Italian word. He spoke in Italian. But he acknowledged the pain that had been caused by the churches, and he lamented that and in very emphatic ways. But what he was most emphatic about was, we've got to move on. You've got to move on. You've got to be reconciled. So when I came home, I had heard about this Anishinaabe elder, Topasana Canoe, who was he was one of the delegates. And I knew he was a respected elder and that he knew the tradition. And I knew not much about the tradition, and I really wanted to learn about the tradition. So I made contact with Topasana, and we became the best of friends. We were about the same age. I was wanting to know all about the Aboriginal tradition, and he was trying to reconnect with the Catholic Church of his youth. So we shared stories. I took him to our services. He got me to the traditional things. He even got me to go to the Sundance in South Dakota. Now, that was a pretty big stretch for me. But most of all, we got to be friends, really, really good friends. And we talked about our common concerns. Like, he spoke to me about the youth. They don't know the ceremonies. They don't know the culture. They don't know the stories. Well, I said, join the club, nor do ours. It's the same thing, you know. I've been telling some people that the colonizers, when we came here, we overpowered the Aboriginal people with our story. We simply crushed them. And now, in turn, this new culture that has been created in the world has crushed our story. And so we're somewhat in the same position. Now, I'm not trying to say the same suffering, but we could understand that. Anyway, Topasana said he really wanted to do something. So one day, we were having coffee in Earl's, and he put a pack of tobacco on the table, and I thought, oh, here we go. So I'm not sure, something's happening, I don't know what. But he said he would like to adopt me. Now, adoption, they have no word for reconciliation in the language, he said, but they have this custom with people they're trying to make who have been enemies that they want to become friends with, or perhaps they've lost somebody and want to replace them in the family. They adopt somebody, and they make them part of the family. They make them kin. So I said, well, I need a little time to think about that. And he assured me it would have nothing to do with my credit card. That this was about friendship and love. So I agreed, and Topasana, he was in his last months. He had cancer, and he had a very, very fertile imagination. So 2 or 3 months later, he said, you know, we're both acknowledged leaders, and we're both old men. So we got to do something for the youth, for the young people. We've got to make a sign. We give them a sign that reconciliation is possible. So what do you think if we do this this adoption, we make it a little larger? Include Fred Kelly, his brother, Phil Fontaine, and his brother Bert. And we're going to do it publicly. Well, it was announced on a Thursday, and on Saturday, about 200 people gathered at Thunderbird House, and it was wonderful. It was emotional. It was something that I will never, never, never forget. Of course, that night I had one of the dreams of my life fulfilled. I watched myself dancing on national news. But you know, it's not just a symbol. It is a symbol. And you know, we've talked a lot about stories. These are stories, and this is an important story. And it really has made a difference, privately, in my life. I never married. And I never had in-laws, but I have kind of in-laws now. Whole new family that I'm getting to know. Mostly the Canoes, because they live in Winnipeg, and Fred Kelly. Fred lives in Ottawa, and Bert is out in the reserve, but it's mostly the Canoes. We visit back and forth. We celebrate together. We had a traditional wedding together. I had my 50th anniversary to the priesthood in May, and they were the head table guests. So privately, this has been absolutely wonderful, and it's been very fulfilling for me. But I think publicly, too, it says an awful lot. You know, we are leaders. I am a leader of the church, and this has been very, very public. I can't think of any Catholic in the Archdiocese of Winnipeg who doesn't know this has happened. And they got to make sense out of this. And I can tell when I meet them, people talk about it, and they don't exactly know what to say, but they know something significant happened. And just, if I can add this, during my anniversary celebration at the cathedral was a big, big, big event. Somebody was, of course, has to get up and say how wonderful you are. And they talked about the thing that was closest to my heart was my relationship to the Aboriginal people, and there was immediate spontaneous applause from the people. They want that. Like, people want to be reconciled. And I think this has shown, you know, again, it's a small thing. For me, it's a huge thing. But symbolically, I think it's very, very important. And what I would like to leave you with is, you know, when we speak about reconciliation, so often we think of how heavy it is and how much we have to do and how hard we have to work and how many risks you have to take. But, you know, it's a relationship. I simply had to receive. I mean, these are 4 guys who are survivors of the residential schools, who had been abused in the residential schools, who asked me to become their brother. Me, a leader, a settler, and a leader of the institution that had abused them. They asked me. For me, reconciliation was accepting it. And it's been a marvelous grace in my life and in the life of my family. It has made a huge difference in all of our lives and in kind of expanding circles. So I really wanted to share that with you today, because sometimes we can see what really needs to be, and lots needs to be done, but things can happen, and they can happen wonderfully, and they can happen gracefully. Thank you.
Thank you, James, for telling us about your new in-laws. Marie. Marie Wilson is one of the 3 commissioners on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. She has over 30 years of professional experience as an award-winning journalist, trainer, and senior executive manager. As a journalist, she's worked in print, radio, and television as a regional and national reporter, and later as the CBC's senior manager for Northern Quebec and the 3 Northern Territories. Now, in making these introductions this afternoon, I have been somewhat shamelessly selective in picking parts of the speakers' bios that have been relating to themes which have woven themselves through the conference so far. So, Marie, I think it's really important to note that you, as a regional director for the CBC, were a pioneer, launching the first daily television news service for Northern Canada against a backdrop of 4 time zones and 10 languages, English, French, and 8 Indigenous languages. We've been talking a great deal about the importance of language and identity. Marie.
Bonjour. Dagonte. We were silent for those many years. Lined up to eat, we couldn't talk. While we were eating, we couldn't talk. We went to school, we couldn't talk. To church, we couldn't talk. When we went to bed at night, we couldn't talk. If we spoke when we weren't supposed to talk, we got punished, sometimes very severely. You learned to be quiet to avoid punishment. We were all silent. We were all silent for these many years. Still today, many of our people don't speak for themselves. Today, I can speak for myself. Idle no more is one good thing that has happened. We can talk. We are talking. No one can keep us from talking anymore. And so I begin Neuetsine Masi by giving thanks for the breath and the voice that has been given to each of us this day, and for the grace that has brought us all safely together. I want to give thanks and appreciation as well to the Chippewas of the Rama Territory and the good welcome we have received here. I'm very conscious of the makeup of this panel, And so I want to acknowledge the very important presence in this room of a number of residential school survivors who are at the heart of our conversation. And I would ask those of you who are either residential school survivors or intergenerational survivors, if you would please stand so that we could know that you're here in our midst and we can recognize you. And I also want to acknowledge the presence of what we call our TRC honorary witnesses. And I will say a very brief amount about that, but I would like to just name them also and ask them please to stand and be recognized, beginning with former National Chief Phil Fontaine, the Right Honorable Paul Martin, former Auditor General Sheila Fraser, the head of your Ontario Human Rights Commission, Barbara Hall. I can't spot Barbara, but I know she was here. Could I ask you to stand, please, so we can also... These are people, in short, who have said, we are prepared to walk the long walk of reconciliation, and to walk it together. We are all in this together. That's the short version of what we've asked them to do, and I'm very appreciative that they're here. You all need to leave this conversation this afternoon yourselves as witnesses. And I think to ask yourselves, what can I do as an individual, and what can I do as a citizen? And I've never had this conversation with Sheila before, and I have to confess I skipped many economics classes in first-year university, but I did get the basic gist of micro and macroeconomics. And I think it's a good way of framing our own role in the work of reconciliation. Those things that we can do on a micro level ourselves around our dinner tables and where we live and work and in those spheres of personal influence, and on a macro level what we have to do with society. And what I will say in a general way is that I think there's an awful lot of micro work being done and a huge amount of macro work still to be done. I am of second-generation Scottish descent on one side of my family, fourth-generation Scottish descent on the other. I was born and raised in southwestern Ontario. I was raised up in the United Church of Canada with a very, very big extended family, 27 first cousins on just the one side, and knew a lot about the goodness and kindness of extended family and being good with and to each other. I married my husband, who is from the Dene Nation, and I've spent almost the last 40 years in the Northwest Territories, which is our home, where our children and our grandchildren live. And through that connection, I am also now not only the spouse of a residential school survivor, but the in-law and daughter-in-law and sister-in-law and auntie of a very big extended family of residential school survivors. And the North had the highest per capita impact of anywhere in the country, with schools that started a very long time ago and were among the last to close. But in this role, most importantly, for today's purposes, I'm one of the 3 commissioners. And I think what is most important, what I can bring to you, is a few of the voices of survivors, because we have now heard in our work from almost 5,000 former students or their family members, in smaller numbers, other concerned citizens who want Canada to know what they think about all of this as they come to know more about it. Kathleen's told you quite a lot, and I'm batting cleanup, as they say, so I know that I don't have a lot of time, and your questions are going to be important. But let me just say in haste, for those of you who are new to this, that our Truth and Reconciliation Commission, probably the most common question I get from people just coming to it is it the same as South Africa's? And I'm not going to go into the complexities of the South African one. What I will say that is so hugely different about ours is that it did not happen as a result of a political will initiative. It came about as a result of a court case. And I'm not the lawyer, and Kathleen and others can speak to that with far more expertise. But to say it's an important point because everything that was described in it is not only a nice guy, goodwill, political initiative thing, it is also a legal and moral obligation. And so that all that we are doing is either in response to that or potentially, in some places, certainly in breach of it. And so we have to think about that as we think about all that is being done. What you also need to know, because you've probably never been told, is that you're signed up in that agreement. In the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it says reconciliation is an ongoing individual and collective process involving former students and their families, those who lived and worked at the schools and their descendants, the government, the churches, and the people of Canada. And so this work of reconciliation, ongoing process that it is, belongs to all of us. We have a job, and again, these are huge simplifications, but basically to gather together as best we can from all available sources the complete history of residential schools in Canada, to collect and assemble that, to document it where it doesn't exist, to safeguard it and safekeeping in a national research center for the long term, and to ensure that that is accessible to all future generations. And so when we talk about the 8th fire in 7 generations and so on, it's not even the young people in the room that I honor, but it is the leadership in you that we have to call upon so that you can take care of that for the future generations to come. We have heard one of the ways, and Kathleen touched on it, that we can collect that complete history is through written record. And that is really the repositories of the federal government and the 4 national churches who were named in the largest class action lawsuit in Canadian history. That's what gave birth to our commission. Getting those records, I think, has been a disappointment to the extent that it has been really resistant and difficult. And of course, leaves begging all kinds of questions of why not, what's the holdback, what's to be hidden, what are we being kept from? The other part of it, of course, because there were not archives being written up at the time by 4- and 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds and their older brothers and sisters, we have to capture the lived experiences of those who were in the schools. And that's what the statement gathering is that we've been doing across the country. When I talk about the people who have spoken to us, that's what I'm referring to. We need to ensure that all of that is kept safe so that, of course, so that we never forget. Very importantly, so that we learn the so much more that there still is to learn. Because going through all of that documentation and those transcripts will be the work of future researchers and family members and so on who want to piece together the fulsome history of our country. And it is also, though, very importantly, so that our country can never again say or pretend or act as if this never happened. What we have heard, and what I would describe as the kind of emotional journey, shorthanded, is stories of great despair and injury. And I will just, these are all quotes, so paraphrased quotes for brevity, but I'll just give you an example or two of each of these. I thought my parents didn't love me, and I thought the Creator had forgotten me. I thought I was all alone. I felt fear and shame and anger. And as I left the school and turned into an adult, I felt rage and hate and blame. And that led me to self-injury and self-abuse, and sometimes to abuse those around me whom I loved. I learned, with the support of my community and services that were available to me, about healing. I learned about the importance of forgiveness, and I learned about love. One of the hardest things for me at school was the abuse that happened by and from other students. Bullying was a huge part of our school experience from older students, and so was physical and sexual abuse. I mention this not to divert responsibility at all, but when we face honestly the hard truth of where we are today and where some of the responsibility sits and resides and what we have to face up to, some of it sits right in the communities themselves. I want to move on to resilience and hope. I can't tell you the number of uplifting expressions of it, and David MacDonald was talking about that. I have raised my children, my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren, and some step-grandchildren. I'm proud to say that I also stress education on them. I didn't want any of them to be on the welfare line. We have learned far more about forgiveness than as a society we deserve to hear, frankly. In fact, it's amazing to me every time I hear the statements after what little children have lived through. If you want to forget something, you have to forgive someone. And I found myself thinking about that in this story of the adoption and the adoption story. If you want to be able to forgive yourself, you have to be willing to change. Think micro, think macro, as individuals, as a country. What are we able to change? What are we willing to change? What does reconciliation mean? Reconciliation is about peace in our homes, in our hearts, in our communities. Reconciliation is about change. Reconciliation is about transformation. It is about remembering, putting back together in a new way. Perhaps it is even about reconstituting on the level of a country if we think about how we might celebrate our upcoming 150th anniversary. Healing is about helping. I help my people, and that helps me to carry on. I believe this is the only way we are going to heal, is to help each other. We have to sit together as nations if we want things to be better for all our children and grandchildren. Let's rise up together to help each other. Let's rise together to help each other. Let's come together. Our spirituality is powerful. We should use that. It will help us. People often talk in their statements about their healing journeys. And very, very often, and it was mentioned yesterday or today, perhaps both, the reference to the Indigenous perspective and the medicine wheel. And I've been thinking a lot about the medicine wheel in the context of translating reconciliation into practical action. Well-being at the level of the head and the heart and the body and the spirit. So at the level of our national head, what do we know about each other? What do we teach each other? What have we taught each other about each other in the past? Only in 2 places in our country right now, although I heard a stated political goal, but I didn't hear a date for implementation from Premier Wynne, only in the Northwest Territories and Nunavut is it mandatory to learn about this 150-year history for all students. In the absence of that, are we continuing to invest in our collective ignorance of each other? What are we teaching in law schools, if not this story and all of the related things, as we heard this morning from Madame Patra? And can we change that? Can we challenge and address that? I'm sure it's being done, but can we make it actually happen? What are we teaching in our medical schools about the backstory to the many people who arrive in emergency wards? What are we teaching our lawyers about the predominant clients that they're going to have until things start to shift around, and our judiciary as well? What are we teaching about language? We've already touched on that. At the level of body, we've heard references to this. How do we keep our bodies strong, collectively and as a whole? What would healing look like in terms of quality housing? What would healing look like in terms of accessible, affordable, healthy food? What would it look like in terms of drinkable water? These are very physical things. And how do they contribute to health and wellness? What about the presence of medical services accessible throughout the country? At the level of heart, relationships we've been talking about. I know this. You don't build relationships in courtrooms. And I'm not the lawyer on our team, but I know you don't build relationships. You establish positions, and you get to know other people's positions, but you don't get to know people, and you certainly don't get to like them and to know what their true needs are. How do we find ways? How do we create space beyond this very valuable space today? How much time and resource do we invest, whether as Prime Minister or whether as National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations or whether as a Premier in this country, to just create a space where you can have a conversation? And why do we have to start from zero every time? Why can we not design our national functioning in such a way that there are regular, predictable spaces where key parties come together for ongoing conversation and dialogue? So who is in the room? I totally agree with that having been said. I've said it many times myself. I think it's extremely important. And the fact of the matter is, most of the time, we're not in the same room. Most of us were not in the same rooms as we went through the school system. Most of us don't live in the same communities, and those who do live in the same communities are quickly made invisible. And then at the level of spirit, and this is the last point I'll make, one of the most powerful individual statements that I have heard from a residential student, and it's one of our sitting senators, Senator Charlie Watt, who's from Coudrock in Nunavik, northern Quebec. He had many important things to say, but his concluding remark was this: I want my identity back. Is that too much to ask? And at the macro level, I would say, and if I may reference Mr. Martin, who spoke so powerfully at our national event, our TRC national event, the 5th of the 7 that we're mandated to conduct in Montreal recently. He said, we are not a Chinese-Canadian country. We're not a Scottish-Canadian country. And another example, which I don't remember, we are an Indigenous country, he said. Why can we not claim that and state that and be collectively proud of that and reflect it in our national symbols, in the greetings that we learn and offer to each other, in the place names of places that we should not only know, but we should understand where they come from? Why would that be so hard? In my own little way, when I was regional director for CBC North in Yellowknife for many years, I inserted, and sometimes in the North you can make things happen because you know people, but I inserted my way into the annual immigration citizenship ceremony. And I said to the people, the citizenship court judge, I said, I'm the head of the national public broadcaster for this region. People need to know what channel their national public broadcaster is on, and they need to know where to find it. And they need to know that it is that, instead of immediately watching American TV. And I incited, and to go back to the issue of what can we do, National Chief Erasmus, who unfortunately has never acted on it, but I said to him, why aren't you there? Why aren't you insisting you're there with a ticket saying, here is the next community feast, there will be a drum dance, call this number if you need someone to come and pick you up and take you to it. So that the question of claiming the space that is there and asserting that responsibility, I think we have to find ways, little and small, to be able to take that on, so that in terms of the spirit of ourselves, who am I? And do I feel good and proud about who I am and where I fit in, and that I am as worthy as one of our survivors said, it took me years of going in and out of churches, in and out of synagogues, in and out of temples, in and out of sweat lodges, before I finally realized that the Creator had created this perfect little being, me. We have work to do, but we are doing good work here. I'm so grateful for the fact that I don't know most of you, because that means more and more people are coming to the conversation. I'm very, very grateful for that. Thank you for sharing this time. I look forward to our conversation, and let us not forget the more than 4,000 little ones who never made it home from school.